Hello, welcome again to Stars, Cells, and God, the show where we discuss new discoveries taking place at the frontiers of science that have theological and philosophical implications, as well as new discoveries that point to the reality of God's existence. My name is Jeff Zweerink. I'm your host today, and we're going to continue looking at the Shroud of Turin. But before we get into that discussion, I wanted to encourage you to subscribe to our channel, Reasons to Believe, and to follow us on social media at RTB_official so you can be informed of our new videos and other content we produce. Once again, I'm joined with Dr. Joe Bergeron. Joe, if you can just kind of remind us a little bit of your credentials. I know you've got a doctoral background or you're a doctor and look at medical trauma. And so kind of give us a little description of what you do.
Yes, I'm a practicing physician in the specialty of physical medicine and rehabilitation, and my practice has really been dedicated to treatment of musculoskeletal injury, assessment, diagnosis, assessment of impairment, done medical legal work, and I guess that's kind of how I segued into studying the crucifixion of Jesus, which was resulted in my book, The Crucifixion of Jesus, a medical doctor examines the death and resurrection of Christ. And in the context of what was a 10-year study for me, I also studied the Shroud of Turin. And so I have some background knowledge about the Shroud, and that's how I come to you today.
Well, thanks. I appreciate your expertise. And I would just say, kind of by way of my personal testimony, that I don't know that I've ever had any real doubt that Jesus was crucified, given what the Bible describes about it. But I do know that the first time I had heard of just the physical trauma that somebody who goes through crucifixion, and to recognize that Jesus willingly endured that,
Yes.
it gave me a whole new appreciation for his love for me and those his followers here on earth, because that is a brutal way to die. And so I appreciate the work you do to help people understand what's going on in that area.
Yes, it was the worst death that could be imagined. It was prolonged with no specific injury to vital organs.
Right,
Crucifixion could last for days, and typically did. So
right.
Jesus' death was unusual in 6 hours.
Very
So
good.
he experienced significant trauma.
Well, I know we've had another episode where we talked about the shroud just from the physical appearance, and do the staining and the position and everything line up with what would happen during crucifixion. But I also know there are issues related to when was the shroud produced, how old is it, those sorts of things. So I know you've got some material on that. So why don't you go ahead and kind of give you a little your information and talk about what you want to present regarding the chemical analysis of the shroud.
This is the Tarkin dress. It's the oldest known linen garment. It dates to the mid 4th millennia BC. And linen is very stable. If you keep it in a clean and dry environment, it will last forever, basically. So to find a linen cloth dating back to the 1st century is not that unusual. Linen was found with the Dead Sea Scrolls and Egyptian mummies and so forth. This is an artistic depiction of the Shroud of Turin. This is from the Pray Codex. Pray is the guy's name. It's not that it's a prayer book, but it is a religious book, obviously. But you can see that it is clearly a depiction of the Shroud of Turin, even to the point that the artist attempted to depict the herringbone weave pattern in the cloth, as well as the burn marks in the shroud, which I said previously were thought to be related to the use of incense. So this is clearly a depiction of the Shroud of Turin. This image dates to about 1190. The provenance of the Shroud of Turin is well known to the mid 14th century. Prior to that, it's largely literary references that folks can study elsewhere, but it's very old and predates medieval cloth. People probably know about the carbon dating in 1988, and the results were erroneous, and for this reason. You can see that the cloth that was dated was cut from a a swath about the size of your small finger, cut into pieces, and then sent for carbon dating. Nobody really questions the laboratory analysis, but it's a sampling problem because what you see, what is well attested to, is that there are uh, uh, cotton fibers mixed with linen fibers in the fringe border of the shroud itself. Now, this is a really unusual finding because it's contrary to Jewish textile law. In Leviticus 19:19, it was forbidden to weave different types of threads together. So the Jews would not have woven cotton into a linen garment. And so what you're seeing when you see the cotton fibers sewn into the edge of the linen fiber is a repair that was done after the fire of 1532 when the shroud was repaired and then sewn to another cloth called the Holland cloth from where it was manufactured and to stabilize and protect it. So what they did, it's a sampling error. They got a sample of the linen contaminated with carbon fibers from the repair, and the carbon dating was from 1260 to 1390, but really what you're seeing is a mixture of fibers. So I think most people will know that the carbon dating was erroneous, and that's why it's erroneous. But there are things we can decipher about the age of the shroud. Linen is manufactured or produced from linseed fiber. And here you see on the left, you see a linen fiber. And it's bent, but it's relatively straight. And you see dark specks in there. Those dark specks are growth nodes. And then on the right side, you see some of the cotton fibers. And the cotton fiber is obviously different. It looks like a spiral piece of tape. The one on the top of the cotton fibers is colored. You can see that, on the one underneath it is not. So the cotton is obvious. It's very different, whereas the linen fiber kind of looks more like maybe like a bamboo shoot or something like that. Now, those growth nodes are important because they contain a compound called lignin. And lignin evolves something you've eaten and everybody else. It evolves a compound called vanillin, which is in vanilla and artificial vanilla flavor. In fact, I read that 40% of commercially manufactured artificial vanilla flavor is harvested from linen fibers. But the peculiar thing about the Shroud of Turin is that it doesn't test. If you test it for vanillin, it's not present. It's not detectable. And it takes a really, really long time for the lignin to evaporate or evolve the vanillin in it so it's not detectable. Let's say 95% gone. Now, that's like linen from Egyptian mummies, Dead Sea Scrolls, but it's not like linen manufactured later. Even the Holland cloth that was sewed in 1350, it tests positive. It's linen, but it still has test positive for vanillin, but the Shroud of Turin does not. So that itself indicates that this cloth is really, really old. How old is it? Well,
So if I could just ask, just to clarify there. So we know how linen is produced basically throughout time.
yes.
And one aspect of linen is that it's got these growth nodes that
Yes.
will produce a substance that we can detect unless
Yes.
there's been adequate time for that substance to either dissipate or evaporate away. And when we're looking at the shroud, there isn't any of that. So that at least puts it quite old. Is there a,
It's really
like
old.
1,000 years, 2,000 years, or can we be that specific?
I'm glad you asked, because the rate of chemical reaction can be known by the Arrhenius equation. And so people can calculate, well, how long would it take for the vanillin to be absent? That can be calculated. The problem is we don't have all the variables. Specifically, we don't know the temperature history of the shroud.
Right.
Probably wasn't frozen, but it also probably didn't get into the 300-degree range, which would scorch it. Now, of course, there are burn marks. We've seen that, but the bulk of the body of the shroud is not scorched, which would be detectable. It would fluoresce on ultraviolet inspection. So that's not true. So it never got into that temperature range. So what we're left with is we have to look at a range of potential temperature. And what I'm expressing today is largely the work of Raymond Rogers, who was on the Shroud of Turin research project. And he did the math. And so I would refer your readers, I could give you the references, but he did the calculations, and he estimated the age of the Shroud of Turin to between 1,300 to 3,000 years old based on this chemical property.
And if I remember looking at your equation there, about the only thing that is an unknown in there was the temperature. It wasn't like there were a lot of unknowns. It was just we don't know the temperature history.
Exactly. But that would throw us into a determination of a range of time rather than a specific time.
Right. Okay. So presumably the colder time, or if it were colder, that would be closer to the 1300s. If it were hotter, things would react more quickly, and that would give. No, that's actually backwards. If it were hotter,
backwards, yeah,
things could dissipate more quickly, and that would give the younger times. Whereas if it were colder, it could have been longer ago before it would have been produced.
Yes, I mean, and if you singe the fiber, it would evolve very quickly. So
Right.
yeah, it's a temperature dependent.
Gotcha.
We know how linen was produced in the first century because of Pliny the Elder described it. Now, Pliny was a voracious student. He studied constantly. He, when he was too tired to read, he had somebody read to him, and then he wrote his work, Natural History, in AD 77, which was basically an encyclopedia, probably the first encyclopedia. And he wrote about how linen was manufactured in his time. And he lived in Rome and Spain, I believe. Now, the fibers of the Shroud of Turin were what's called Z-spun, which means that the spindle was rotated clockwise. That's an important observation because it would indicate that the cloth was spun in the northern provinces of the Roman Empire as opposed to the eastern provinces or North Africa. In Pliny's description, he said that hanks of yarn would be bleached separately, then woven into the cloth, and this would cause a variegated coloration or plaid kind of pattern, which is in contradistinction to how cloths were manufactured, say from the 13th century on, where the fabric would be bleached after it had been woven together. The yarns would be stabilized during weaving with starch, and then it'd be washed with a deterrent, probably soap, wheat, or saponaria, and then dried by evaporation. Saponaria has known toxic and hemolytic meaning to dissolve the blood cells, and preservative quality, which is a potential explanation for why the blood on the shroud looks red instead of dark or black. And here you can see this ultraviolet picture. This shows the hands, but what I want you to see here is the faint plaid pattern in the background. And that is consistent with Pliny's description of how linen was manufactured in the first century.
So was it largely manufactured that same way up to the 1300s? Because you'd mentioned that they changed the procedure somewhere around or at least the bleaching procedure up around.
The bleaching procedure was, I've read that. I don't know the evolution of textile history and how it was manufactured, but I know the bleaching process changed about that time. And that's the way the Holland cloth was bleached all at once, which was in 1532. This is the whole picture of the shroud. You can see that the front and back images can be overlaid. You see the fire component, where the burn marks there, the what's called poker marks, which are thought to be from incense during worship. Presumably the shroud was a tablecloth, and worship incense was waved around over it, or I guess, I'm not sure what they would have done, but that's what it's thought to be. The triangular components near the burn marks are repairs. So this is how the shroud looks the full structure. Now, the characteristics of the cloth, it measures 437 by 111 centimeters, 0.34 millimeters thick. Each thread has 70 to 120 linen fibers. It has a herringbone weave. Now, if you have a wool jacket, it's probably herringbone, but that's a very interesting and peculiar finding. The color of the image is yellow, or more specifically sepia, and it's only present on the top 2 to 3 superficial fibers within thread, each 10 to 15 micrometers in diameter. The variation of the color is not due to the density of the color or the change in the hue of the color, but it's rather the number of fibers that are colored per unit area, and that's called the halftone effect. And by direct visualization and extensive chemical testing, there's no evidence of applied pigment, bodily fluids, aside from the blood stains that are obvious.
So you're saying, so if you go back to the slide there, you're saying that the coloration variations are not because some were stained better than other. It's the number of fibers in, or the number of fibers in a particular or number of threads in a particular fiber that were colored.
Yeah, it's the number of fibers that were colored per centimeter, let's say.
Per centimeter, okay.
You know, per unit area, and that's not because the pigment was darker in that area. You understand?
Yeah, yeah. So I presume that allows some way of maybe measuring, you know, it gives a discrimination because certain things might have, or it could potentially give a way to date when it might have happened based on the dyeing method or something of that nature, correct?
No. I'm talking about the image of the man.
The image of the man, okay.
The image of the man is on superficial fibers, just 2 to 3.
Oh, okay.
And the image, whatever parts of the image that you can see that are darker than, say, another part, maybe the bridge of the nose versus, you know, the thumb or whatever, it's because of the density, the number of fibers that are colored per unit area. It's not because the pigment is darker in one place than another.
Okay, so this is actually the image that shows up of the man is what's caused.
That's what I'm talking about. The image of the man.
Good. I appreciate that clarification.
Yeah, sorry, I should have been more clear. Moved on from the manufacturing part. I'm talking about where the image is,
right,
and how the image got there, because we saw, you know, it has characteristics of like a photograph, but it's not a photograph. Photographic technology didn't exist till 1820s, and then you have obviously, you know, the pre-codex is from 1190, and there are literary references that go far back. So we know it was around long before anybody photographed anything. It's not a photograph.
Right.
But what I want you to see, talking about the image of the fiber, this is from the bridge of the nose. And you can see here that you see the threads, and then you can see some that are discolored. And it's just the top superficial 2 or 3 fibers that are colored on some of the threads. You can see what I'm saying there. And that's what forms the image. There's blood on the shroud. Here you see blood. I believe this is from the spear wound, where you see the cellular components that are red, which again is unusual, probably because of saponaria that called hemolysis and preserved it. And then you see the gold area, which represents the separation of serum from the cellular components of the blood. Now, the chemical tests, the blood stains were removed by proteolytic enzymes, which revealed that the image of the man was not present below the blood stains. So the image occurred after the body was wrapped and the blood stains were on the cloth. Also, the formation of the image didn't affect the blood. And that's an important observation. Because some folks will want to propose high energy mechanisms of image formation, but that would scorch the fibers and the blood itself, and that would be detectable chemically. There's iodine detected starch on the shroud, which be consistent with the Pliny's description of weaving, stabilizing the threads with starch during that process. Proteins were not detected on the shroud except where there were blood stains, and that's an important observation. There's no exudates from the human body, other than blood that's obviously seen, and bacterial contaminants, other sorts of things that might potentially cause discoloration are just simply not present. There's no pigments, no paints, no human exudates except the blood. And the cloth was subjected to a severe test by fire, where components of it were burnt, which you saw. And if there were paint on the shroud, that would be detectable just visibly and by multiple chemical testing, but the heat effects of scorching the paint would be easily discernible also. And the cloth was doused putting out the fire, so didn't disrupt, it didn't change the image, didn't cause it to bleed or penetrate or smear.
So if I understand the basic process, or at least some of the timeline, this cloth was wrapped around the body that was dead. There was blood deposited, or whatever's coming out of the wounds deposited onto the shroud, and then somewhere after that time, the coloration of the yellow coloration of the fibers happens.
Yes,
because where there's the blood, that's not happening.
Right.
And that's pretty fascinating. Okay, so this isn't something that's just, some sort of interaction of the shroud with the body just as it's buried that is causing this. It's got to be sometime later, it sounds like.
Yes, it's sometime later, and there has to be some sort of image transmission. You understand, let's say you smear paint on your face and you wrap a napkin around your head and pull it off. It doesn't look like you.
Right.
So it's not a contact and transmission mechanism that formed the image of the man. It's some sort of, some sort of reaction that occurred, remotely from the body, transmitted to the cloth and formed the image.
Okay.
Is that understand?
Yeah. So it's not because the cloth was in contact with the body. It's some sort of process going on in the body that is interacting with the cloth more or less uniformly everywhere.
Yes. Now the blood stains did come in contact with the cloth, and the blood flow on that you see of the blood stains is more consistent with, maybe capillary action as it percolated along the cloth itself. But the image of the man that has kind of almost photographic characteristics, that could not have been by a contact and transmission.
Right. And then, as you were mentioning, because of some of the way the linen was prepared, the cloth had some sort of preservative effect for blood residue.
Yes.
Which is what allows it to stay around so long.
Yes. Yeah, precisely. And that would be consistent with saponaria. You got detergent options were limited in the first century. It's probably soapweed that would have been used in that time.
Right.
Cellulose is a recurrent cyclic hydrocarbon molecule, glucose molecule. If you subject cellulose to a high temperature, a temperature mechanism such as caramelization or other things, that you would extract a water molecule from it. But if you do that, then you create a highly reactive free radical carbon that is going to bind to the atom next to it. And that's important because folks will propose high energy mechanisms of image formation, but if that were the case, then we're going to see signs of that. And this will be detectable on refractive studies and other things, as well as direct visualization even. And what you see on the left is a linen fiber that was lightly scorched. And you can see that the cross-linking between the molecules is starting to occur. The gross structure of the linen fiber is degrading. The medullary, or the internal component of the fiber, is turning dark. So this fiber is on its way to being incinerated, but didn't. go all the way. But you can see, if you want to say that there was a high energy mechanism that formed this image, it's going to affect that fiber in some way that's detectable. But that's not present apart from the obvious burn spots. And on the right, you see an imaged fiber that is completely, the cellulose fiber is completely normal. The medullary component is clear, which meant that the image itself didn't penetrate into the fiber.
Mhm.
And its architectural, the gross architectural structure of the fiber is maintained. So
Yeah,
now,
'cause one of the things that I'd heard, one of the ideas around, assuming this, if this were Jesus' burial cloth, that his resurrection had some sort of high energy X-rays that would come off and produce this sort of effect. And if I get what you're saying here, is the fact that you don't see any evidence of that in the linen fibers, the cellulose linen fibers, is a strong argument against any sort of scenario like that.
correct.
Mhm.
I look at X-rays every working day of my life. It's not an X-ray. Doesn't look like an X-ray. And I used to have an X-ray machine in my office. I did in spinal injections with fluoroscopic guidance.
Mhm.
And what probably people don't know is that X-rays fly through cellulose like it's not there. In
Right.
fact, there's companies that make X-ray tables made out of wood, capitalizing on that property of cellulose. So for something to discolor the cellulose, uh, X-rays are basically photographs. When I was a student, I had to go to the hospital basement, wait for them to be developed, pull them out, put them on a light lamp to be able to see them. So now it's all digital, but you understand it's basically a photograph. So how can that even be true? It just doesn't follow. I guess most folks wouldn't know that, but yeah, I had an X-ray in my office. I had to have a radiation physicist come and do checks all the time because people sitting out in the waiting area could be exposed to radiation, and I had to be very careful about that.
Right.
So for an energy mechanism to create a change in the color, it would have to change the fiber itself, which didn't happen.
Right.
Now, this is a fascinating thing here because adhesive tape applied to the shroud pulled off what they called ghost fibers. This was a shell on top of the imaged fibers that contained the pigment.
Okay. So the fibers, going back to your statement, that was like the top 2 or 3 fibers is what was giving the pigment its color.
Yes.
By applying some adhesive tape, you could strip that off of the fiber.
Yes.
So it's not an
There it is.
actual change in the fiber itself. It's a coating on the fiber.
Exactly.
Hmm.
It's a crust or shell on top of the fiber that is where the image formed by a chemical reaction. But that's where the image is.
Okay.
And this pulled the image crust off the fiber, and the fiber was unharmed beneath it.
All right. And somehow you have to have a process that puts this substance on the fiber, but not on the blood residue that was on top of the fiber already.
Yes, it would indicate that it's a low temperature mechanism that bound to a crust or shell on top of the superficial fibers. So how do you explain that?
Right.
So the characteristics of the image linen fibers are is that the density is not changed. So from the image to the non-image, which means that would be easily detect any kind of pigment, any kind of human exudate, anything like that. If the body of the cloth were exposed to high temperature, apart from the burns, there was not evidence of that, which would be detectable on ultraviolet inspection. Any kind of neutron exposure would remove hydrogen, causing degradation of the cellulose fiber chain that we talked about previously. The color could be stripped off with the ghost fibers, but it could be removed by a reducing agent called diamide.
Mhm.
That indicates that the image was formed by a chemical reaction or chemical bond to the superficial residue or shell on top of the superficial fibers. So in sum, the any kind of applied pigment, heat, radiation, high energy hypothesis for image formation are not supportable. They're excluded. The findings suggest that the image was formed by a chemical reaction on the discontinuous topmost parts of individual surface fibers.
So it sounds like this is, one, I just find it fascinating learning about the details of what you can find. The idea that this is a layer on top of the fibers, not a change in the fiber itself. There's no degradation of the fibers.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of scenarios like the high energy, Christ rises and a burst of gamma rays or whatever type thing that are ruled out. Are there good explanations for what might form this type of image, if you will?
I'm glad you asked. Dr. Rogers postulated the Maillard reaction would be the most logical explanation. What this is a reaction with a reducing sugar or polysaccharide. So that would be consistent with the starch that would be used in stabilizing the cloth while it was being woven. And it would be a chemical reaction with an amine or nitrogen compound. This is a low energy, commonly observed chemical reaction that creates pigment as a side byproduct. So, and again, this is chemically distinct from a thermal mechanism like caramelization or something like that. So period linen, like I said, would most likely be washed with saponaria, soapweed, and dried on a flat surface, which would cause it to, in most of the world, that's the way they do their laundry now. You know that. They wash it in the river and lay it out to evaporate and dry.
Right.
Then there would be residual impurities from the wash would accumulate on the upper surface by evaporation. And a decomposing cadaver will emit ammonia compounds or amine gases fairly quickly. Police dogs can detect these things and find bodies that way.
Right.
So it doesn't require a lot of decomposition for this to occur. And I think this best explains all the observed observations. Now, if the image of the man was formed by the Maillard reaction, it would indicate that the Shroud of Turin had been used as a burial shroud, but removed from the body before the liquid components of decay were present, roughly 36 to 72 hours.
And so when you mean liquid components of decay,
exudates from the body.
Without getting too graphic, what are you talking about there?
Exudates from the body.
Okay, so just as the physical components of the body decay, they're going to liquefy and...
Yes.
Okay, very good. And so that has to happen. You said there between 36 to 72 hours is when the time frame for that happening?
Yeah. Estimate, yeah.
Okay. So this seems to be another piece, not that it proves that it was Jesus' burial cloth, but given the description of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, he would have been in the burial cloth for, somewhere on that 36 to 72 hour time frame, depending on how you count the number of days that are elapsed there. So that would be very consistent with that at minimum.
Yeah. Now, one thing that I think we should point out, the Maillard reaction explanation for the image formation doesn't require a miracle.
Mm-hmm.
And other explanations, high energy mechanisms do.
Right.
They have to, by the underlying premise has to be that it is absolutely the authentic burial cloth of Jesus Christ, and that the miracle occurred, and therefore we had this high energy mechanism, and that's how the image formed. Well, if you can explain it without a miracle from a scientific perspective, that's highly superior. And in medicine and other disciplines, we talk the concept of Occam's razor, which has various iterations, but essentially that the explanation with the fewest number of special assumptions is most likely correct. And so here you have something that explains all the observed facts, which are many, as I told you.
Right.
And it explains all those, but doesn't require a miracle to explain those are commonly observed chemical reactions.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, if you want to say there was a miracle, I think it's interesting that they chose the side of the cloth that had the residue deposit on it to have in contact with the body. You follow me?
Not quite. Explain that a little.
Because the contaminant from evaporation drying would only be on one side of the cloth.
Oh, okay.
The side that was
Gotcha.
face up evaporating, and that happened to be the side of the cloth that was adjacent to the body.
So you could very easily, if they just wrapped this the other direction, with the top being the bottom and vice versa, or the inside being the outside and the outside being the inside, you would have never had any sort of image in the first place.
I think that's correct. If this explanation is correct, yeah. Assuming this is the correct explanation, I think that's correct, yeah.
Well, and going to your point, I think it's remarkable that this is consistent with Jesus' death and burial and resurrection. But really what it's saying is somebody had been buried for a while and then the cloth is removed, whether that was because somebody broke into the tomb and took it out, or, I could envision a number of other scenarios where you might have that happen for a while and then the cloth be removed. But I do find it fascinating that at minimum it is consistent with the resurrection, or the death and resurrection of Christ.
Well, and it's consistent with the Shroud of Turin being an actual burial cloth.
Right.
Because it wouldn't, the image could not occur by this way by any other mechanism that I can think of, except that it wrapped the body and was removed before liquid components of decay were present.
Well, that's an interesting point. So if it were by the Maillard reaction, there's almost no other way to fake that, if you will. It has to be a decaying body of some sort.
I wouldn't.
Or a dead body,
I can't envision how it could have been produced any other way.
Interesting. So we've got along with the description of the physical description of where the blood was, where the wounds were, that we did in a previous episode, you now have this scenario or explanation or set of circumstances where the investigating where the residue comes, how do you get the pigment, whether it's part of the fiber on top of the fiber, and then how do you produce that, also find something that is, assuming this is the explanation, virtually no other explanation outside of this being wrapped around a dead body.
I believe that's correct. To me, this far and away is the most logically driven explanation for image formation.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
And what I find fascinating about it, honestly, is that it's not the initial, ooh, this looks like it might be a burial cloth. It's like, as you probe in and dig deeper and understand what could and couldn't be and where it all is, the evidence seems to get stronger and stronger for that the more we know about it, not trying to make an explanation stay consistent even as we know more about it.
Yes, and what I find unfortunate and why I'm happy to do this talk with you is that so much that we hear about the Shroud of Turin is half-truths and spin and inaccurate information. I think a careful examination of the facts is fascinating, and it's, as I said at the beginning, that to say that the Shroud of Turin is the authentic, whatever that means, burial cloth of Jesus Christ, that's a personal determination, I think. But what we can say is that this has every distinction of an ancient burial cloth that specifically is consistent with the description of the biblical description of Jesus' crucifixion. You had asked me about dating. We talked a little bit about the lignin and vanilla testing. There was a recent test of X-ray refraction where the X-ray refraction of the linen fibers of the shroud is consistent with linen that was found at Masada.
Okay.
people may know that Masada was the final blow of the war between the Jews and the Roman Empire that started with the siege of Jerusalem and ended with the siege of Masada in AD 74. So it's first century linen, and the X-ray refraction of both of cloth from that time and the shroud are similar. That is not a mechanism for dating the cloth, but it is an observation of a physical characteristic that, again, as with other things taken together, plausibly places the Shroud of Turin as a first century piece of linen.
So kind of flesh that out a little bit, because the fact that it's consistent with other linen cloth that we see from that period, I get the connection that, okay, at least it's consistent and it could be. Why is that not sufficient to date it to that period of time?
Well, for the X-ray refraction, it's because, and my friend Barry Schwartz will be quick to say, that's not a mechanism for dating the linen, and that's true. And I guess that would be the take home on the X-ray refraction study. It would be a reach of that technology to say, oh, we've dated it now.
Right.
So I think that's a reach of that observation. And then the other thing with the vanillin test is it takes us to a range of dates.
Right. Okay. So in order for that to specify that, you would have to have some other independent means of saying this type of cloth was only used in that period. So in principle, it could have been older, it could have been newer, but all we can say at this point is it was consistent with the type of cloth that was used in that era.
Well, when you say type of cloth, that's a different kind of statement. The linen itself and the age of the linen is consistent with first century. Jerusalem linen is different. And I'll move on. Can we move on, or you have more to talk
please,
about?
yeah, please go ahead. Move on.
Let's see, where was I? There again, I'm closing with the image of the shroud. If you have any questions about that, we can talk about that. Linen in Jerusalem in the first century, so far as we know, was not woven in a herringbone pattern. The archaeological finds that we have are simply not like that.
Okay.
And so this is one argument that people have said, well, no, this is not from first century Jerusalem, because they just didn't weave things that way.
Mm-hmm.
So the Shroud of Turin seems to be a first century cloth, and certainly, and evidence would indicate it's a burial shroud from someone that fits the biblical description of Jesus Christ and his crucifixion. Where'd the shroud come from? Where was it manufactured? Weaving cloth was done by hand. Every household, it was a household chore. Everybody wove cloth. To buy a ready-made cloth was extremely extensive, and you find even evidence of this in the scriptures. The story of the Good Samaritan, they beat the guy up, and what did they do? They took his clothes. Why? They could sell them. Clothes had a high premium. They could be sold. They were passed down from generation to generation in wills and be willed to somebody. They gambled over Jesus' garments because clothes were expensive and difficult to obtain. It would take several people a month to weave a Roman toga.
Right.
So, and my friend Barry Schwartz at shroud.com, he believes that Joseph of Arimathea had the Shroud of Turin in his possession before they took the body down. Because you think about it, you didn't walk to the corner of Walmart and buy a piece of linen.
Mm-hmm.
And to have a burial shroud on hand would be, you might do that if as part of your end of life planning, but it would be difficult to obtain in short order right before while the sun's setting, to go out and we read the Gospels and we put it in our modern times, but in the time we live, but in their time, the sun's setting in 20 minutes, I need to run to Walmart and get a burial shroud. They would not be able to do that. So it would suggest that it's a ready-made cloth. And anyway, the weave pattern is inconsistent with temple or Jewish linen in Jerusalem in the 1st century. But the herringbone pattern was common in the Roman Empire. And I told you previously that the shroud fibers were Z-spun, which meant they were spun clockwise. That would be consistent with Rome and the northern provinces of the Roman Empire. But the eastern provinces, North Africa, would have what's called S-spun, which would be counterclockwise.
Okay.
And the herringbone pattern, this is Trajan's Market, Flora. It's near the Colosseum. I saw it one time. But you see the herringbone pattern in the floor still there. Dates to the 1st century. They used this pattern in their architecture and in the structure of the Roman highways. Apparently, they felt it probably true that it was a more resilient or resistant sort of structure. And so it was a common place in the Roman Empire. And Rome had a large Jewish expatriate population in the 1st century. I've read that up to 10% of the population of Rome was expatriate Jews. In fact, you see in Acts chapter 2, the day of Pentecost, it specifically mentions Jews were there from Rome, both Jews and proselytes.
Right.
So there was a large Jewish contingent in Rome. So my opinion, my belief is that the Shroud of Turin was most likely manufactured in Rome for export, and Joseph of Arimathea purchased it, would have been outlandishly expensive, purchased it as part of his end-of-life planning, which, again, the stone-cut tomb, family tomb, would also be really expensive. So he was a person of means. And that's also part of the prophecies of Jesus, that he was buried with the wealthy. So it's my opinion that the Shroud of Turin was manufactured in Rome, that Joseph of Arimathea had it in his possession as part of his end-of-life planning, because the herringbone pattern and the Z-spin is of the fiber weave is more consistent with a Roman manufacture. And that's maybe a little bit different than how we read it. It seems when you read the Gospels, you think, oh, he went out and bought it, and but some translations, for example, Young's literal translation of Mark 15:46 says, and he, Joseph, having bought fine linen and having taken the body down, wrapped him in the linen and laid him in the sepulchre. So I think at least some interpretations of the scripture could allow for the concept that Joseph had in his possession previous to Jesus' crucifixion.
Well, I really appreciate your presentation here, Joe. It's just fascinating to learn all that, what we can do just by looking at a careful chemical analysis, that coupled with a physical analysis and looking at just the history of what's going on there. To me, it's fascinating that when you put all of that together, the idea that Jesus was crucified on the cross, had this excruciating death, hemorrhage, just traumatic hemorrhaging going on, arms or wrists pierced through with nails, that when we look at the shroud, that we see evidence that this is all consistent with what's going on. And you can paint a very coherent, consistent, very plausible story that this was actually the burial cloth of Jesus. Now, whether it is or not is a separate question. And I love the way you said that you can look at the facts and then you have to determine what's the best way, what you're going to believe about them. But the idea that after all of this study, we can put together a coherent picture that at very minimum shows that the description given in the Gospels aligns with what was going on. And in fact, we could even make a reasonable case that this played out and was actually Jesus' burial cloth. Is a fascinating conclusion to come to, and to me, it points as strong evidence that the Gospels are giving us an accurate account of what was going on, and that we can be very confident in the truth of Christianity based on that. Any final closing thoughts here before we end up?
Well, I was never interested in the shroud. I thought it was controversial, and I thought I could never sort through all of that and make heads or tails of it. But as I studied it, I thought, this is really fascinating. And the more you study it, the more you understand the plausibility that, this really could be the genuine article. And Ray Rogers, whose work I was citing through most of this, was a chemist at Los Alamos National Laboratories and had an appointment in the University of California system. He never heard of the Shroud of Turin. He said, give me 20 minutes in the scientific method and I'll prove it's a hoax. And far from that, he became, I think, the guardian of the accurate scientific information of the Shroud of Turin. And I can provide you and your listeners to references that I would recommend. But I think we're indebted to his extensive work to have an accurate understanding of the scientific investigation of the Shroud of Turin, which is extensive as we've gone through just a part of it.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. I appreciate your time today. And thank you for joining us today on Stars, Cells, and God. I want to encourage you to join the discussion in the comments below. Remember to like this video, to subscribe for more content. New episodes of Stars, Cells, and God release each Thursday and are available right here on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. Be sure to share this video with a friend. And remember, the more we learn about science, the more we have reasons to believe.